but not physically present. My name is Charlie Kenny. I didn't say that at the beginning, and I am the director of the Center for the Americas. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Rachel Schwartz. She has just come to us as an assistant professor of international area studies. Her research focuses on the legacies of armed conflict, state building, corruption, and human rights in Central America. Her book, and we hope to have a book presentation in the spring for this. It's called Undermining the State from Within, the Institutional Legacies of Civil War in Central America. It's being published by Cambridge University Press. And we're going to invite a scholar who also writes about Guatemala, who also has a book coming out in the spring, for the two of them to make a presentation in the spring. Rachel's dissertation was awarded the 2020 Gabriel Almond Award for the best dissertation in comparative politics by the American Political Science Association. Her research has been supported by the Fulbright Program, United States Institute of Peace. During 2019-2020, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research, CIPR, at Tulane University. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Rachel, who will be addressing this topic of why do corrupt governments invite international anti-corruption commissions.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And I want to thank both Charlie and Stephanie for all of their organizational work to make today happen. I'm really delighted to be here. As Charlie mentioned, I'm new faculty, so I'm really grateful to the CIS and broader OU community for welcoming me during my first few months here at OU. So today I'm going to be presenting work that's actually part of a new research agenda for me, at least, on the drivers and consequences of international partnerships to combat corruption and impunity. And so kind of as a point of departure, if I could get slides to work, there we go. In recent years, corruption has certainly surged to the top of the international policy agenda. I don't have to tell this crowd that. We just had a very large symposium, of course, on corruption and authoritarianism here in the College of International Studies. But this focus on corruption at the international level is certainly driven by a sort of increasing recognition that corruption drives economic and political instability globally. So for one, corruption can certainly hinder or distort the provision of basic goods and services, healthcare, infrastructure, education, public security. And in this way, it can also diminish citizens' trust in government institutions. And there are, of course, also global security implications of this, where governance is distorted by corruption and people don't trust institutions as a result. This can open up space for non-state, sometimes violent actors, criminal organizations, insurgent groups to fill the governance void. And so even though there's this increasing international recognition of the need to combat corruption, there's also an increasing sense that corruption cannot be tackled solely in a domestic fashion. So leaving the pursuit to corruption in the hands of state agencies might be thought of as tantamount to asking political leaders to investigate and prosecute themselves. Just a sort of brief anecdote here. When I was doing fieldwork in Guatemala in 2015, sort of at the height of the work of one of the international anti-corruption commissions I'm going to talk about, the CICIG, I remember sitting down with a political analyst who then went on to be a presidential candidate. And I said to him, why do you need an international commission to help you all fight corruption? And he said to me, Rachel, asking the Guatemalan government to fight corruption on its own is like asking Dracula to stand guard over the blood bank. You're not going to get the results that you want. And so a number of sort of new hybrid, and by hybrid, I mean sort of joint international domestic initiatives and partnerships have emerged. So for one, the UN General Assembly held a special session in 2021 dedicated entirely to the fight against corruption. There it also launched a new initiative known as the Global Operational Network of Anti-Corruption Law Enforcement Authorities. This was intended to provide prosecutors and investigators the tools and technical capacities they need to tackle corruption. But in addition to these broader initiatives, the international community has also championed what I call international anti-corruption commissions. And that's sort of the subject of my presentation today. So what are international anti-corruption commissions? These are bodies that are politically and financially backed by international organizations, and they operate hand in hand in partnership with domestic government agencies to combat corruption through investigation, through prosecution, but also through promoting legislation and institutional reforms. And so in a lot of ways, these commissions look like sort of domestic anti-corruption agencies. They perform a law enforcement function. They also seek to promote anti-corruption awareness and lobby for reforms to combat corruption and impunity. But there's also some important differences between these types of commissions and purely sort of domestic agencies tasked with investigating and prosecuting corruption. These are sort of joint international domestic partnerships. And so they're thought to be more independent, to be relatively insulated from the meddling of political and economic elites. But they also benefit from local knowledge and expertise because they do work hand in hand with the local investigative, prosecutorial, and judicial systems. And so on the one hand, they're thought to be much more independent, but on the other hand, they do require the authorization of a national government. A national government has to say, yes, United Nations or Organization of American States, we want you to come in. We're going to sign a formal sort of treaty or partnership with you in order to establish this International Anti-Corruption Commission. Now, scholars who have looked at these types of entities have sort of lumped them into this camp of what they call governance delegation or shared sovereignty arrangements. These are essentially bodies that domestic governments sort of outsource routine government functions to, right? And so other examples of governance delegation are peacekeeping missions, police assistance commissions. There have been international commissions to help countries manage their debt, right? But I argue that we can't necessarily lump IACC's International Anti-Corruption Commissions in with these other types of entities because they entail a different set of domestic incentives, right? If we step back and we imagine a government wants to invite in a UN entity to help the police force strengthen its capacity and its training in order to be able to improve its ability to provide citizen security. We can imagine why domestic politicians would be in favor of that, right? It would be seen as perhaps strengthening their legitimacy, improving their ability to provide public security, and in turn, it could sort of strengthen domestic political support for the government. By contrast, when we think about international anti-corruption commissions, it's a lot harder to imagine that alignment of interests and incentives, because at the end of the day, international anti-corruption commissions are going to come in and necessarily expose government corruption. You're essentially inviting somebody to sort of expose the skeletons in your closet, so to speak, right? And so this presents a bit of a puzzle. Why do governments invite these types of entities in, given this risk that they are going to expose corruption amongst government officials and their allies? And so that's kind of the puzzle that's motivating this project. What explains the emergence of international anti-corruption commissions? And given this incentive structure, given all the reasons why we think that domestic political elites would say, not so fast, keep those things as far away from me as humanly possible, why do they allow them in? And so in sort of thinking about the answer to this question, there are a couple of potential explanations that I've sort of synthesized. And a lot of them come from research on international justice. For example, why states cooperate with the International Criminal Court. And so there are sort of 5 sets of potential explanations that are worth highlighting here. So the first focuses on the role of domestic civil society organizations, and particularly their linkages with government officials, which allow them to sort of move corruption and particularly promote the introduction of an international anti-corruption commission towards the top of the national policy agenda. And so this is one potential explanation that scholars have explored, again, in the context of sort of participation with other international judicial entities. Another explanation, there are elections on the horizon, and in order to signal your own sort of your own intention to break with the corrupt regime that might be in power, you propose these as a way of sort of garnering support. And it's a sort of, it's a direct response to electoral incentives, right? So that's a second possibility. A third is that governments authorize international anti-corruption commissions because they are mired in very high-profile corruption scandals. And they need to sort of signal that they are willing to clean house, correct course, and implement reforms in order to address previous corruption, right? And oftentimes, this often goes hand in hand with mass protests that really do sort of gin up popular pressures for reform. So those are the first 3. And they all sort of at least imply in some sense that the government might have a sort of genuine interest in implementing these things, even if it sort of responds to domestic political pressures or electoral incentives. There are also 2 more cynical explanations here. One is that the introduction of an international anti-corruption commission is merely sort of following the global anti-corruption norm in order to allow the government to sort of look like it is following the global consensus. It's part of the international community. It's, you know, it's a modern, transparent, clean government that wants to serve the public welfare, right? So this is a sort of international anti-corruption commission as window dressing, right? It's all about appearances and not about a sort of genuine intent to clean up corruption. And then finally, and this is perhaps the most nefarious of these potential explanations, is that governments adopt international anti-corruption commissions, not because they're interested in cleaning house and going after corruption within their own governments, but they see these as tools to go after political challengers, to go after their rivals, and essentially criminalize and neutralize them politically. And this sort of explanation is what some scholars have found with respect to the International Criminal Court. So not unlike these international anti-corruption commissions, states who are harboring political leaders who are accused of mass human rights violations have to actually send people to the ICC. They have to cooperate in this process of extraditing perpetrators of human rights violations to the ICC. And so when are they more likely to do so? Well, they're more likely to do so when the accused perpetrator is their political rival, right? This provides a really convenient way to get rid of challengers to your government, right? So these are 5 potential explanations. They're certainly not mutually exclusive, right? We can sort of see multiple of these explanations perhaps operating simultaneously or at different points in the sort of process of launching an IACC or authorizing an IACC. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to focus on 3 international anti-corruption commissions. I'm actually going to focus on one very briefly at the end, the anti-corruption commission that didn't happen in Ecuador. But the three that I am going to focus on all emerged between 2007 and 2019 in the three northernmost countries of Central America. So in 2007, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, known as the CICIG, was launched. It was financially and politically backed by the United Nations. In 2016, Honduras launched the Support Mission Against Corruption and Impunity in Honduras. And this was backed not by the United Nations, but by the Organization of American States. And then finally, in 2019, El Salvador launched the International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador, CCS. And this was also backed by the Organization of American States. And so those are the three that I'm going to focus on in order to tease out the extent to which these potential explanations help explain why the government ultimately invited these commissions in. And so before I get there, spoiler alert, all three of these commissions are no longer in operation. Between 2019 and 2021, they were one by one kicked out of their respective countries. I'll get to that towards the end of the presentation because I certainly think that there is a connection between the nature of the commission, its work, and its longevity. But I think it's still worth, despite the fact that these are no longer there, I think it's still worth understanding the sort of factors and conditions that allowed them to emerge in the first place. So that's one sort of caveat. A second caveat is that it's of course really important to recognize that these things didn't each emerge independently. They didn't emerge in a vacuum, right? The CICIG, which sort of had a very, as I'll talk about in a second, a very lengthy process of developing in sort of fits and starts, it certainly made thinkable the possibility of implementing similar entities in Honduras and El Salvador. There's no doubt about that, right? But I think it's also important to explore the trajectories of each of these commissions to sort of figure out, are there some common factors that can explain these three cases, or do these things look quite different? And so let's start with the CICIG in Guatemala. So the seeds of the CICIG were sown during Guatemala's peace process, which unfolded in the sort of early 1990s, culminating in the Accord for a Firm and Lasting Peace signed at the end of 1996. And part of that peace process was the human rights community in Guatemala recognizing and sort of putting on the table the importance of tackling criminal structures that are sort of rooted in counterintelligence and counterinsurgent actors within the military, and sort of rooting them out. These sort of networks of what were essentially military-led organized criminal groups were still lingering. They were carrying out human rights violations, they were engaging in corruption. And so as part of the peace process, the human rights community said, we need to focus on eradicating these clandestine security structures. And so as part of the Comprehensive Agreement on Human Rights, one of the peace accords, the government of Guatemala committed to ensuring that there would be no, these were called CIACs, C-I-A-C-S, which in Spanish refers to this very unwieldy term, cuerpos ilegales y aparatos clandestinos de seguridad, which essentially means sort of illegal security forces and clandestine security machinery. It's a very bizarre, unwieldy term, but if you say it in Guatemala, everybody knows what it is. So this was part of the mandate, right? However, sort of facing deep political fragmentation and ongoing human rights violations during the post-peace governments, there were increasing civil society calls for the international community to step in and help get rid of these predatory criminal structures within the state. And so during the administration of populist government, the populist government of Alfonso Portillo between the year 2000 and 2004. Civil society really sort of ramped up pressure and began working with the United States to create what was called at the time CCX, a commission against these CX, these predatory criminal structures, right? And so the Portillo government was notoriously corrupt. And however, there were a couple of folks within the Portillo government who really also championed this cause, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, a guy by the name of Edgar Gutierrez. Edgar Gutierrez happened to be a human rights leader who led the Catholic Church-backed Truth Commission following the Civil War. And so he was a key ally of civil society organizations and really succeeded in sort of putting the International Anti-Corruption Commission issue at the top of the agenda. Now, this initial attempt at creating a commission fails. The Constitutional Court says basically in allowing this commission to sort of hands-on investigate in the absence of a domestic partnership, it was sort of violating national sovereignty. And so they go back to the drawing board under the subsequent administration of right-wing President Oscar Berger. And during the Berger government, a man by the name of Eduardo Stein, who's pictured here on the left, who is vice president at the time, becomes very, very interested in advancing this commission. And that's how we get the CICIG. And so this is a case, I argue, Guatemala is a case in which across subsequent administrations, there were government insiders with close linkages to civil society who succeeded in putting this issue at the top of the national policy agenda. And that's what allowed this to take root. So that's what I would say, our sort of first explanation: domestic civil society pressures and strategic linkages with government. That's sort of the explanation that I would argue best explains the Guatemalan case. So that's Guatemala. The next commission that emerges does so about a decade later in Honduras, the support mission to combat impunity and corruption in Honduras. And so this is a case in which, one, the CICIG's example certainly mattered, right? Over the course of the CICIG's subsequent 8 years, particularly but in 2014, 2015, they begin uncovering very high-level criminal structures within the state. And it just so happens when this is unfolding in the Guatemalan case, Honduras is hit with its own massive corruption scandal. So in particular, Honduran prosecutors uncovered a scheme within the Social Security Institute in which the ruling government of the National Party, led by President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's pictured in the middle, embezzled about $355 million to fund his own presidential campaign and the congressional campaigns of his members of his party. And so this story breaks and people flood the streets in a sort of mass movement known as the Indignados. And it just so happens that this corruption scandal and this mass protest is unfolding at the same time in which the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, is trying to change the Constitution so that he can run for re-election. And so ultimately what happens is, without civil society participation, but sort of given the popular clamor, Juan Orlando Hernandez goes to Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, and says, okay, help us, come in and help us create a commission to strengthen the investigation and prosecution of corruption. Now, he does this in such a way that it was quite clear he intended to create an International Anti-Corruption Commission that was significantly weaker than the one created in Guatemala and backed by the United Nations. For one, the OAS is not as strong of an institution. It doesn't have the sort of same financial resources. And ultimately, the agreement that the OAS and the Honduran government arrives at, what happened? Later. Ultimately, the agreement that the Honduran government and the OAS arrive at basically ties international officials' hands, right? All of these investigations have to be done by Honduran investigators, right? OAS officials can sort of help, but they can't be in the courtroom trying corruption cases, whereas in Guatemala with the CICIG, they are, right? And so this was sort of a case in which I think a lot of these potential explanations come into play. So one, we have high profile corruption scandal, mass protest, right? That sort of puts the popular pressure, ramps up the popular pressure, right? We also have electoral incentives. This guy's trying to change the Constitution so he can get reelected. And I should say, he does get reelected in an election that many suspect was fraudulent. I should also say that he stepped down from power in 2021, was promptly extradited to the United States for aiding and abetting drug trafficking by the Sinaloa cartel. So that's kind of where that story is going. So we have that at play, right? The electoral incentives, mass political protest. But we also have the sort of idea that this is kind of window dressing, right? This is meant to sort of placate the international community. It's meant to placate Hondurans that are taking to the streets, but it's not really given a mandate that will allow it to make a sort of meaningful dent in the anti-corruption struggle. With that said, what it manages to accomplish in the 4 years it's in operation with this limited mandate is quite extraordinary. It uncovers corruption by a previous first lady and successfully prosecutes her, for example. So there are some key victories of Moxie, victories that probably led to its ouster in 2020. So that's Honduras. Last but not least, we have El Salvador. So the Salvadoran case was the last to come along when President Nayib Bukele, pictured here, in 2019, authorized the creation of the International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador. This was also backed by the OAS. It was sort of very much part of Bukele's campaign platform in the lead up to the elections that he won. Now, importantly, Nayib Bukele was a sort of outsider political candidate that he's called himself on Twitter the coolest dictator in the world. He's frequently seen sort of wearing backward baseball caps. He sort of led the charge to make Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador, something that most people would say has failed miserably for reasons that are obvious if you've been following what's been happening to Bitcoin markets. But Bukele came in with a sort of campaign platform that was all about tackling corruption that was prevalent within the previous administrations led by the two sort of long-standing parties in El Salvador that emerged after the peace process, the right-wing Arena party and the left-wing FMLN party. And so during the post-peace period in El Salvador, these are the only two parties that had sort of gained national prominence, that had won the presidency. But Bukele and his Ghana party come in and take power kind of as an outsider railing against the corrupt political elites of Arena and the FMLN. Part of his campaign platform is the creation of a CCS. However, it's very, very clear that his goal in creating a CCS is to go after corruption in Arena and the FMLN, right? And so it's only in 2021, when CCS begins investigating pandemic-related fraud within Bukele's own government, that he says, never mind, see you later, CCS, and kicks it out, right? And so this is the sort of case of an international anti-corruption commission being utilized as a tool to neutralize political challengers, right? And so this is, ultimately it doesn't work, essentially, right? And it doesn't work, and so Bukele sort of kicks the CCS to the curb. However, this reflects a very different sort of pathway than what we saw in Guatemala and Honduras. It had this sort of underlying cynical, nefarious motives that Bukele had in sort of authorizing the CCS. It's also worth mentioning that it had an even weaker mandate than the MAXI in Honduras. So CCS was not an independent institution during the time that it operated. It was housed under the executive branch. It was meant to sort of provide advice to executive offices combating corruption, but it had absolutely no autonomy, right? And so we see over time, not only the duration of these international anti-corruption commissions shrink little by little, we also see their mandates become much more limited. And again, I think this is where the sort of interaction amongst the three of these cases matters, right? The folks in Honduras were looking at what was happening in Guatemala. The folks in El Salvador under Bukele were looking at what's happening in both Honduras and Guatemala, right? Sorry, folks in Honduras were looking at what was happening in Guatemala, not El Salvador. So the findings here, and I'll sort of go over this very briefly, is that I don't think there's one singular pathway or story that we see in terms of why these international anti-corruption commissions emerge. In the Guatemalan case, we really have sort of an instance in which domestic civil society organizations sort of partner with committed government officials to make this happen and to sort of put this on the policy agenda, the national policy agenda. There are some high profile scandals that are happening after the CSIG is authorized, but they happen after sort of the agreement is signed as the CSIG is beginning to launch. In Honduras, we have sort of high profile scandal and mass protests. We have electoral incentives, and of course, this idea of international anti-corruption commissions as sort of window dressing for appearances. And then finally, in El Salvador, we see electoral incentives and this sort of cynical motive to criminalize political opposition being the kind of main motivators of why the CCS takes shape. Now, all of these are cases in which international anti-corruption commissions actually emerge. They don't tell us when and why they don't emerge where we might expect them or where international and domestic officials are trying to create them. But actually we have that case in the country of Ecuador. So Ecuador is a really fascinating case. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it for the sake of time, but I'm happy to talk more about it when we open up for discussion. But essentially, in Ecuador, beginning in 2019, they tried to create what was known as the International Commission to Combat Corruption that consists of experts, 5 experts from the countries of Spain, the United States, Brazil, Guatemala, and Honduras, who would work with the Ecuadorian justice and prosecutorial system to strengthen them. And what ends up happening is after sort of 2 years of delays, the thing falls apart. And it's actually not really about domestic government pushback as we might think. It's actually about disagreements between these 5 experts, these international officials, and the sponsoring international organization, which is in this case, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Basically, the UNODC sees this as kind of an advisory body, whereas the experts want to have much more of a hands-on approach in investigating, exposing, prosecuting corruption. And so it's really interesting because it's actually the sort of misalignment between international organization officials and the sort of IACC officials that sends this thing off the rails and never allows it to get off the ground, rather than domestic pushback. So that's a lot of information I've thrown at you. And I promise I'm wrapping up now because I'm interested in hearing your questions and thoughts. But a couple of sort of core findings here that I think are worth highlighting. So one, I don't really find that there's any kind of single explanation or pathway for why governments invite these international anti-corruption commissions in. I think we have to sort of be attentive to the diverse actors, the context, the history in which they're operating, and the incentive structures that those things create. I also think, and this is sort of getting back to my earlier point about how all three of these Central American commissions no longer exist, I think there's also sort of important implications for how they're created, or sort of the relationship between how they're created and how long they actually last, right? No doubt, the strongest commission of these three was Guatemala's CICIG. It lasted for a little over a decade. It made a lot of progress. Much of that progress is now being thrown in reverse. However, because it sort of emerged from longstanding government civil society linkages, it ended up being much more durable and able to sort of mobilize a much broader cross-sectoral coalition in favor of the commission. In the other two cases, we don't really see that, right? These are sort of reactions to one, domestic political pressures, but also there are intentions to limit the extent to which these commissions can actually investigate and prosecute corruption. And I think also, and sort of this goes back to, I think, some sort of broader discussions and conversations about what's happening in Central America right now, which sort of looking ahead to this spring, we're hoping to sort of organize some events on rising authoritarianism in the region, because we're certainly seeing that. And I think that one lesson that we could take away from these international anti-corruption commissions is that they provoked quite a virulent backlash that has really had detrimental consequences in the region. And so does that mean we shouldn't promote them? They shouldn't exist? The international community shouldn't have a hand in helping countries combat corruption? I'm not sure I would go that far, but I think it's really important to be attentive to the sort of pro-impunity, pro-corruption coalitions that mobilize in the face of these initiatives, what their strategies and their tactics and their goals are. I think that's all I have. Yes, I believe so. Yes, that is all I have. Thank you very much. I couldn't get the slide to change. Yeah, I'd be really happy to hear any questions or comments or thoughts.
So we'd like to entertain questions, please, students and faculty and whoever. I think it might be good if we took a few questions to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could answer those, and then we can go back to another.
Rachel, very interesting material, lots to think about. But I sort of think, what are the conditions under which international, transnational entities enter into these agreements with government? Presumably they're negotiated, and first of all, it strikes me that the conditions that governments seek to negotiate tell us something about their motives.
Mm-hmm.
But I also wonder whether or not to look at your El Salvador case in particular. The question that occurs to me is one that, in some sense, flips the puzzle a little bit, and that is, why is it that, whether it's the Organization of American States or some body of the UN, why did they agree to go into these arrangements with governments where they're relatively toothless and easily manipulated? So I guess a couple of questions there involving, what are the range of things that governments negotiate? And I can imagine it includes everything from, where the, as you talked about, who conducts the investigation, who's in the courtroom, who are who's the principal public spokesperson for the progress and the findings of it, et cetera, et cetera. And why ultimately will, say, the Organization of American States go into one of these agreements, under terms that where they're basically easily manipulated to the political objectives of the government.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Professor, I'm just starting to apologize for that. But I was just wondering, you mentioned the differentiation between OAS and UN.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, in the Ecuadorian case, the UN failed. So how is it possible that magnitude of oversight of a UN can fail, but we are saying that the OAS has problems?
Mm-hmm.
My second question is that a question from what is the incentive for an international organization to get involved? What is the consequences? Of course, for the community themselves, yes, there is a consequence because they're enough. But why is it that we would say that we impose our standards and something happens, nothing happens? But what is the advantage for the international society?
Mm-hmm.
Are drugs going to be less? Are there going to be less turmoil in that part of the world?
Great. Michelle, yes.
So I was thinking of all the other possibilities, right?
Yeah.
International commissions. And I was wondering if you see a difference between the mandated commissions that come into the country and that are part of previous agreements that we have signed off. So, all these human rights laws that are part of the human rights treaty, and therefore it's almost like when the commission will visit the country, of course, we're talking about short visits.
Mm-hmm.
That is negotiable, but the conditions of the visit and the reports that come out are not, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then the country has to do it. And in this case, it feels like it's not mandated, right? It's something that we opt to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes the neighbor, for instance, street commissions as well. They're not mandated, right? And that commission can also be established. So you see a difference between them and the incentives that are involved.
Yeah, that's a great question. Should I start answering? Okay, those are all really phenomenal questions. I guess I will tackle the sort of why do international organizations agree to this, particularly under terms in which there's a sort of, very limited or weak mandate. And I think this, for international organizations that are concerned with sort of global security issues in Central America, of which the international policy community consider there to be many, chiefly among them organized crime and drug trafficking and migration, of course, which here in the United States is certainly treated as a international or an issue that impinges on U.S. national security interests, right? And so I think that there is, I think part of this question goes back to the desire of these international organizations to do something to help, but also a sort of reticence to use the sort of heavy-handed forms of imposition that they have previously, right? If we think, invading countries in order to sort of change government structures or, imposing transitional administrations, right? I think this is a much more sort of politically palatable strategy to be seen as sort of helping countries fight this issue, which is a sort of international security issue ultimately. I think that there's also a hesitance to push back against efforts by governments to weaken these mandates on sort of national sovereignty grounds, right? Like ultimately these international organizations and their charters all recognize state sovereignty, and state sovereignty is central. And so I think that it provides the international organizations a sort of nice way of saying, hey, we're helping, but also we're doing it in this responsible, contextually aware way, right? By partnering with domestic institutions. In terms of Mitchell's other question about sort of what governments negotiate, so there's a lot that governments end up negotiate. The sort of big one, and the one that sort of distinguishes Guatemala from the rest, is like, can international officials actively participate in corruption investigations? Can they sort of actively participate, you know, in litigating, right? Can they be in the courtroom? But also there are all kinds of other things that are negotiated around the ability of these international anti-corruption commissions to partner with other state agencies. So for example, in Guatemala, the CICIG established separate sort of agreements to assist the national police, to assist the organismo judicial, the judicial system, to assist the Human Rights Ombudsman's office, right? Those were all sort of agreements that were between the CICIG and these specific state institutions, like outside of the purview of the executive, right? And so that happened there. That was something that was completely precluded in El Salvador. Whereas in Honduras, well, the interesting thing about the Honduran case is actually that even though, you know, they limited the ability of international officials to partake directly in investigations and prosecutions, there was an effort to sort of establish a citizens observatory to sort of monitor crime and violence and corruption and provide public information. There were separate agreements between the Honduran government and the Honduran police, for example. And so they did allow those types of partnerships. It was really just the prosecutorial capabilities of international officials that was left out. So there are a lot of things that are negotiated in these contexts. The question about sort of why the UN failed in Ecuador, this is a really interesting question. And I think that, so I think ultimately what happened was, and this again speaks to the fact that these things, you know, these commissions aren't emerging in a vacuum, right? They're, you know, folks who are working on the Ecuadorian commission are looking at what happened in Guatemala. And so what ends up happening in Ecuador, which they start to ramp up after the CICIG gets kicked out of Guatemala, is that the UNODC in Ecuador is very hesitant about giving these 5 experts on this commission greater authority to investigate and prosecute, because they're worried that it's going to prompt the kind of backlash that we saw in Guatemala, which led to the ouster of the CICIG. Meanwhile, these 5 experts on this commission are basically like, well, what role are we actually, what are we actually going to do if we can't, you know, actively assist in these types of investigations, right? And so it's that sort of misalignment, which I think speaks to the UN at that moment, their sort of reticence to give this commission more power given what had just happened in Guatemala. And then Michelle's questions, sort of to what other institutions do these explanations apply? Is that the, yeah. And yeah. So I guess when I think about the sort of UN human rights, you know, special repertoires and these sorts of things, right? I think that they don't, you know, they do, I guess, you know, getting invited in is to some extent at the discretion of the government, but, you know, the reports they produce are the reports that they produce and governments have to comply. I guess, I think that, you know, my sense is that the enforcement mechanisms there are quite a bit weaker than, you know, what we would see in the context of these international anti-corruption commissions. And so I think that there's that sort of specific difference there. And the same thing with truth commissions, right? I think about, you know, Guatemala's UN-backed truth commission, which is a really interesting case because on the one hand, it, was invited in as part of the peace process. It was part of the peace accords. On the other hand, the military negotiated so that it would have no prosecutorial ramifications. It would not name names of perpetrators of human rights violations. So they did try and sort of, restrict the scope of its work. What's also really interesting in that case is that Guatemala still ended up pursuing human rights perpetrators in some sense on the basis of some of that Truth Commission work. So it actually, those restrictions ultimately didn't work, and there have been human rights trials in Guatemala. But yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about the Truth Commission comparison. I've sort of been thinking about police missions and peacekeeping missions because they often get lumped in with those things, but the Truth Commission one's really interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Professor Rachel, actually, we can have other people first. Sure. Sorry about that. Scott?
Oh, thanks. So the existence of these IAS because we're living in an age of anti-corruption that is on the road. The growth in the discourse and organization around anti-corruption has just been phenomenal in the last 20 years. And consultants and international organizations are always going to look for something to plug into. They're rarely going to say, no, I can't work in this situation. And then at the same time, the advocacy for establishing anti-corruption commissions, essentially any investigatory bodies that specialize in corruption, has been a standard recommendation in the anti-corruption movement's repertoire for, again, 20 years, despite the fact that there are vanishingly few cases you can find where they work in a very clear, identifiable way on their own.
Yeah.
The cases of failure are far outweigh the few numbers of success. And even those success cases are very contingent subject. So with that as background, I'm wondering, does the absence of the international dimension give you more confidence that the likelihood of having some benefit goes up in this, or I know your research is focused on why they are perfect. But if you focus to their ultimate effectiveness, does it give you a little more confidence, or are we back in the same boat?
Yeah.
Where, get a stylized figure, it seems like 9 out of 10 anti-corruption.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess just tying to that, one question we had about what the commission do, especially for the monitor, is it just about investigations, or do they help other types of institutional reform that would be useful to make countries more resilient to corruption? And that's because, of course, investigating corruption is important. Or you spend 10, 15 years investigating. You can always cause a new event of corruption, but at some point,
right? Yeah. 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 Thank you. Hi.
So I love the comparative because you seem useful, but I love you've also spent a lot of time on the ground in South America. So I'm thinking about the local nexus with the national and international, and sort of the at the end of the day, the accountability to public politicians, determines whether or not they stay in office or stay alive.
Right.
And so thinking about human rights organizations that have these local offices, a lot of close relations with educational institutions, and there's kind of this rich civil society culture around human rights. So I'm just curious if you've seen that side of local on the ground perspective, and if that shapes then what's happening with the national and international platform.
Yeah. It's a great question.
Just want to let you answer that.
Okay.
Simply, you kind of not timing it, but not on the fact that they all kind of die on this.
Yes.
And so that suggests that there may be things operative that are simultaneously.
Yeah.
It does seem that the circumstances in which they were made is quite different. And Guatemala clearly attacked its own government, right, in a way that the others were designed not to.
Right,
To the extent
right.
possible. So there's like learning on the part of the political elite.
Sure.
Okay, we'll have one of these, but
Yeah.
we're not going to have a Guatemala.
Yeah.
Right? And then it was like, no, we're not going to have these because.
Yeah.
Because is there a change in international norms?
Yeah.
Revised, other
Mhm.
forces in the world are just saying no to this kind of stuff, and it's all about sovereignty. And it's not
Yeah.
about-
Yeah.
Does that play a role? So.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So I guess to start off with Scott's question about sort of does the international dimension of this add some benefit? I think that in 2016, when I was conducting my dissertation research, I would have said absolutely. And part of why I'm undertaking this project right now is because I'm actually no longer so sure. I think that if you look at, the case, the Guatemalan context where this commission was the most successful, we saw sort of, countless high-profile corruption schemes that were sort of uncovered, dismantled. A president and vice president were ousted from power. And the sort of reach of the CICIG, it wasn't just, in the executive branch. There were schemes that were uncovered in the National Police, the Ministry of Energy, even in the public prosecutor's office, right? And so I think everybody sort of considered this to be the shining case. But when we look at what happened post 2019, and in particular, just over the last year in Guatemala, all of those prosecutors who worked with the CICIG were sort of threatened with trumped up criminal charges, and they're all sitting in Washington, D.C. now as asylum seekers. That also goes for certain judges that collaborated with the CICIG. And so we've seen a reversal that I think a lot of folks would argue has not only taken Guatemala back to where it started, but perhaps has become even worse. And I think part of the issue and part of the sort of drawback of the international dimension is that it's very, very easy for a government to say, well, this commission is overstepping its boundaries, it's violating our national sovereignty, we're not extending its mandate, right? And that's a sort of easy justification to pull out of your pocket in order to get rid of these things. And so I think to the extent, like, they do lend legitimacy and help sort of mobilize an anti-corruption coalition in a way that I think is really, really important. But the backlash that we're seeing is quite jarring, and I think speaks to this sort of issue of like, is this reversal as a result of the international dimension of this, even worse than it would have been in the case of just a domestic agency. For Fabio's question, yes, I should have explained this a little more, but so in the context, particularly of the Guatemalan case, the CICIG actually did a lot more than expose and prosecute corruption. So they helped lobby for a series of legislative changes that gave prosecutors new tools like wiretapping. They didn't have access to wiretapping in Guatemala, and then prosecutors did, and that helped them sort of conduct their investigations and make their cases. Plea bargaining wasn't really a thing in Guatemala. This was something that this was a change that was spearheaded by the CICIG. The CICIG also helped create a series of high impact courts within the judicial system. So these are specialized courts that were staffed by the most highly trained, well-respected judges. And they were sort of taking on the most sort of prominent, notorious cases. Most of those judges are now out of the country. They've also been the target of these sort of trumped up criminal probes that have unfolded in Guatemala. So they actually did a lot. And I think also it's important not to underestimate the sort of political role of these things. You know, if you talk to the commissioner of the CICIG, the last commissioner of the CICIG, Iván Velázquez, who's currently the Minister of Defense in Colombia, actually, he would say, well, we don't, you know, corruption knows no ideology. We don't pursue people from certain political parties. We, you know, we take the cases that come to us and sort of we go after them because nobody is above the law. And I think that sent a really important message to a lot of people in Guatemala in terms of like mobilizing a sort of broad coalition of people. And so in that sense, the work that they were doing was certainly political, right? And so I think that's also an important thing to remember. But again, given the reversals that we're seeing, you know, it's hard to argue that those were that real sustainable change in favor of anti-corruption, anti-impunity unfolded. Amanda's question about sort of how the local perhaps filters up. I think this is also a really important one to consider. And I think, you know, we see that in Guatemala, at least in the sort of very foundation of the CICIG, right? It was the human rights communities that said, like, listen, these sort of clandestine military structures, they didn't go away with the peace accords. They're still here. They're still wreaking havoc, and we need something to get rid of them, and we can't do it on our own. And so they sort of brought that concept kind of into the vernacular in a way that government officials and subsequently the international community could then sort of latch onto as well. I think also, interestingly, in the Guatemalan case, so before the commission got kicked out, the CICIG was working on opening offices in more rural areas of Guatemala. So in Quetzaltenango, which is a predominantly indigenous part of the country, as well as in certain areas of the Northwestern Highlands. And so this was, I think, directly a response to civil society clamoring for this institution to have visibility and play a role outside of Guatemala City, right? And so I think that is another way in which we saw those dynamics unfold. But there were very strong partnerships between, you know, indigenous organizations, human rights organizations, universities, and the CICIG when it was when it existed. And then finally, Charlie's question about, you know, the fact that all of these things kind of die at the same time. Is there something going on internationally that perhaps is sort of turning the tide against these commissions? I think, you know, there's no question that the Trump administration was a lot less interested in sort of supporting anti-corruption, and a lot less interested in sort of thinking about anti-corruption as a way of preventing undocumented immigration, which we know is sort of at the top of the US policy agenda, for better or worse. And so that, I think, certainly played a role. But I think there's also, you know, it's interesting when I think about the 2015, when Otto Perez Molina, the then president, who was sort of found to be orchestrating this sort of major customs fraud scheme in Guatemala, that whole thing was uncovered in 2015. And for a really long time, he kind of resisted stepping down. And there were kind of rumors circulating that it was when then US ambassador to Guatemala said, listen, dude, you got to go. That's when he finally stepped down. And so there was kind of this sense that the US really did, you know, have a tremendous amount of political weight in determining the fate of these things and the fate of politicians who supported them or didn't, right? And I think we're also, this another sort of takeaway is that the United States just no longer is such a weighty player in Central America. I know it's hard for us to imagine, given the whole sort of Cold War history of Central America, the US not mattering as much, but I think that is increasingly true. I mean, yesterday, the US military gave 95 vehicles to the Guatemalan military, 95 vehicles. In 2019, right before the CICIG was ousted, the Guatemalan military drove US donated vehicles around the US embassy as a way of sort of intimidating them to say, we're doing this, don't push back. And yesterday they donated more vehicles to them, right? Like, I just think that, you know, we're in a place of complete sort of stasis when it comes to US policy on Central America. And I think folks like Bukele and Jamatai in Guatemala, and certainly Ortega in Nicaragua, they know this, right? And so, yeah, I think it sort of reflects both Trump administration sort of disinterest and willing to sort of take their eye off the ball, so to speak, but also the fact that, you know, I just don't think the United States has as much clout as it once did.
Thank you very much for this point. My question is pretty much that you're aware of any kind of work that can facilitate those organizations, any similar organization. The idea is that there is, I would say, the belief among in the government that they might be covered up for
Mm.
Is anybody really doing good work?
These international anti-corruption commissions. Yeah.
Is it really or is it covered up with some of the
No, they were actually doing the anti-corruption work, but I'll tell you a funny, not so funny story about this is that so one of the early attempts by sort of economic elites and the military, ex-military folks to get the CICIG out of the country, basically they concocted this story that so there was a Russian couple that was sort of forced to flee Russia under persecution by the Putin regime. And they participated in a sort of fraudulent scheme to get passports, fake Guatemalan passports. The CICIG went after this fraudulent passport ring, ends up charging this Russian couple. And then essentially what happens is that economic elites in the country who are against the CICIG say, oh, this is a great opportunity. They start calling the CICIG a tool of Putin to go after this political opponent of his. And this ends up leading to the United States, the Senate Western Hemisphere subcommittee led by Marco Rubio, basically putting a halt on US assistance to the CICIG for about 6 months until they investigated this and made sure that the CICIG was not a tool of Putin. And so this is the type of really savvy, strategic smear campaign. And they even had Bill Browder, the guy who helped create the Magnitsky Act in the United States. They had him testifying in Congress against the CICIG. Mary O'Grady, a columnist who writes about Latin America for the Wall Street Journal, she was in on the hit, so to speak, sort of smearing the CICIG and on the pages of the Wall Street Journal, claiming that it was this sort of entity that was directed by Putin. And so there's absolutely, I want to be clear, there's absolutely no evidence that it was, but the ability of these folks to sort of attribute these sort of nefarious motives to these commissions had serious political consequences. And I would argue that that moment was the beginning of the end for the CICIG. Once folks realized, okay, we could get away with saying stuff like this, combined with the sort of Trump administration disinterest, it was over.
We can continue this conversation, but we want to first thank Rachel for a great presentation.
Thank you all.
From the questions, there was a lot of interest, and so I would also like to thank Stephanie for making our seal and everything else that is possible. 2 weeks from yesterday, we have another American lunch here. The speaker will be Annabelle Ibsen from the Sociology Department. She's going to be speaking about Chile's double crisis gendered labor legacies of authoritarian liberalism. And on the 29th of November, a Tuesday, you're co-sponsoring a film that is about the environment and mining in an Andean community in Peru.